The artist is Stanley William Hayter. It is an engraving and etching with soft ground and embossing in color. Okay. This is part of the exhibition at the museum right now, Brilliant. And this piece, along with two others by Hayter, state proofs of the same print, are there on view. So I suggest you all come back when the museum gets open. We have luckily extended Brilliant to be up a little bit longer. And so you should be able to get back in there and see the exhibition. So as I describe this work, we're going to go through and sort of break it down into the components of it. But I also wanted to give you a brief history of Hayter and his Atelier 17 to kind of put it in context these prints. So a quick word about editioning, I guess I should say. This, as you see down here, is my cursor there, Heather?
Yes, it is.
Okay. You see it listed there as HC and 9. So people are always interested in all this printmaking nomenclature that's at the bottom of prints. It's usually the edition number. HC actually stands for Hors Commerce, which is French for that the proof was set aside to aside from the edition. So usually they were done for maybe publishers or galleries to show the pieces prior to them being printed. So we actually have one of those. So it doesn't mean it's necessarily any different from the edition, but it's made in a smaller edition and may have been produced first. Okay. So this print also has 4 states, and we're going to look at 2 other states. This is the finished state, or the 4th state of it, and we're going to look at state 2 and 3 as well. So early in the 20th century, engraving was kind of considered a tired conservative process. We think of like Albert Dürer or Renaissance art, or even currency. You know, folding money is all done with engraving. Hayter took an old method and really reinvigorated it, and combining it with innovative ideas and adding a complexity and depth to the artwork itself. He was British born, and he's considered one of the most significant printmakers in the 20th century for 2 reasons. First, his own artistic practice of skilled engraving and his ability to mix etching techniques. He arrived at these complex, multi-layered compositions of tone and value. Secondly, he's associated with some of 20th century's foremost avant-garde artists. In 1927, Hayter opened his print shop in Paris, and in 1933, he moved locations, renaming it Atelier 17. The shop, because artists in Paris were interested in printmaking, it attracted many artists. And some of the artists that came to the shop during that time were Picasso, Giacometti, Juan Moreau, Alexander Calder, Marc Chagall, Kandinsky, Mauricio Lazansky. And the nature of a print shop, excuse me, is one such that you're in a small area. As you can see, the artists here sitting there basically shoulder to shoulder working. So there's a lot of an exchange of ideas going on in a studio like this. They're having conversations, they're looking at each other's work. Very different than an artist working in his own studio and then maybe inviting another artist to come over and see his recent work. And this atelier really was founded based on the idea that there was a demand, there was an interest in these artists for learning these techniques. But Hayter never thought of himself as a teacher. He was really insisting that the workshop was a collaborative space, and everyone working there was contributing to what he referred to as researches. This is a drawing by a French artist by the name of André Masson. He would have been working in Paris at the same time, and he's really well known as a surrealist, but he was interested in dream imagery and the subconscious. So he pioneered this technique of automatism or automatic drawing, which refers to creating art without conscious thought, accessing material from your unconscious mind, sort of a dream state for the creative process, where the hand is allowed to move freely throughout on the paper with kind of not consciously controlling it. And then the artist would go back and kind of bring out that image, you know, with additional marks. So Hayter employed this method throughout his career. So here is the second state of combat. This is also on display right next to the fourth state that we have. So what you're seeing here in this second state is all engraved lines. Down at the bottom there, you'll see, I think it's ESSAIE maybe, which I think is French for test, if I'm correct. So this is sort of a test plate. This was not meant to be additioned, but he did mean it to be presentable because obviously he signed it. So also from the same year. So this is as he's working through the process to figure it out. It's all drawn with a burin directly on the plate. So here's a close-up of what you're seeing. And the line engraving, I have a little diagram there with a picture of the burin or the tool that would be used. So instead of a drawing implement, a pencil on the paper, Hayter would take a copper plate, which is what the etching was made from, and put the burin down into the surface of the plate, and then he would turn the plate randomly and kind of unconsciously, and he would make all of the marks that you're seeing throughout the surface of the plate. And then some of the things, he then went back with his etching tool, and you can see some additional material. It looks like a hand here. You can see kind of a face here that's upside down. So he's gone back into his kind of subconscious automatic drawing and then brought out some of the details. Okay. Here is state 3. So now what Hayter has done is he's taken the plate with the straight engraving, and then he has added aqua tint and soft ground. Okay. Aqua tint is, it's basically taking a ground material which keeps the, which covers the whole surface of the plate. He has the engraved lines on there. He covers the plate with a hard ground or a soft ground material, and then he's taking actual cloth and pressing it into the soft ground. And you can see here, where my cursor go, you can see that this is like a cheesecloth here, and then this is a tighter woven fabric, and then we have yet another type of fabric here and another here. So what he's done is he's pressed these different materials into the plate. They've exposed the plate itself, and then he's etch this in acid bath. And the acid, of course, would eat in at different layers. And then some of the areas are aqua tinted, which are a process where light granulated rosin is put onto the plate. It's melted to block out the acid, and then a gray areas are able to be etched into the plate. And once again, Hayter was sort of a master at this material, so he is not just randomly doing this. Here's the three of them together. He's working these plates. He's bringing them back and forth. So as I said, on this one, he's engraved a little bit more. Here he's carefully brought certain areas out. He's burnished areas, which means he can make them lighter. And so he's emphasized the dark areas. And then in the final copy, or state 4 you were seeing on the right, he's added color to the plate as well. So to get back to Hayter's ideas, I have a quote here from him when he's speaking about design or the movement of his composition. He states, "In such involved three-dimensional imaginative compositions, it becomes necessary to follow, without confusion, the relation of one element to another without losing the trace. The moment the trace is lost by the artist, the result to the observer will be absolute confusion. One might say that the more fantastic the frame of the composition, the more clearly it must be realized. If it is to be understood, the development of the work shows a progressively increasing complexity in each state, with secondary simplifications taking place from one to the next until the final state is reached." So one of the things, actually your pictures are all kind of stacked up here, but one of the things you can see here is this circle, which wasn't over here. So he's actually taken and burnished this and used a tool called a scorper, which would basically clear out the plate. And that's where the embossing takes place. So the plate is smoothed of any detail, and then when it is inked, that area does not receive any ink. That's just the plate. So when the pressure of the press and the paper is pushed within the copper plate, then these areas that are white on the paper actually are a raised area within the print itself. So yet again, adding another complex level to this print. So back to a little bit more about Hayter and his Atelier 17. With the outbreak of World War II, Hayter has to relocate the Atelier 17 to New York City. And here is a photograph taken from 1942 that shows the mostly European artists actually in the Atelier 17 studio. So if you look, it's kind of a who's who of avant-garde artists. And we see Hayter here in the first row, sitting here. It's a very, not a very candid photo if you notice how everyone is sitting in there, all facing one way, Hayter looking directly at the camera, very staged photograph. But these are the artists that would be there working in New York. And once again, working in a small shop, and the word got around, of course, that this was happening, and more American artists started to find out about it and started to come and see what was going on in the shop itself. So This is a Andre Masson. We talked about him before. This is a 1942 etching and dry point that was done at Atelier 17 in New York. So once again, you can see it's a different approach, but it's also that kind of automatic line where he's brought out details, and it's a much more kind of surreal print that's worked, but also it has that same feel. So this is what was happening at that time in the studio. Now, American artists were coming in, and these young American artists wanted to work with Hayter as well. The studio became a central meeting place for the young Americans. So artists like Louise Bourgeois, Minna Citron, Dorothy Denner, Louise Nevelson, Willem de Kooning, Robert Motherwell, Mark Rothko, David Smith, and this artist, Jackson Pollock, came. This is a Pollock etching and engraving, I'm sorry, from 1944-45. It was, it was actually created at the Atelier, but never editioned. So he worked on about, I think, 4 or 5 plates at that time, and did not edition them and print them. They went into his studio, and then they were kind of rediscovered after his death. And I believe they were printed through MoMA in 1967. And it says here by Gabor Peterdy, who was one of the artists that worked with Hayter at Atelier 17, a master printmaker himself, and also started the printmaking program, or taught the printmaking program at Yale. One of the people who really continued this printmaking process and brought it to many students afterwards. So what you're seeing here with the Pollock, of course, is once again the automatic line. Pollock is doing the same thing. He's putting the burin, the engraving, into the plate. He's turning it, he's creating from his subconscious, and then he's kind of bringing out this, what else is happening within the plate. He's making light areas and dark areas, bringing out figures, pushing areas back. He's making a few things that are recognizable. It looks like a fork laying down here. Looks almost like there's some writing. But once again, it's this all over kind of patterning that he's doing. And what I think is important that we're seeing here is, and I'm not the one to come up with this idea. Of course, Joanne Mosier talked about it back in the 80s, that Pollock always credited Masong for the automatic line and how he arrived at his mature style. But I also think Hayter played a big role in that as well. And here's Alchemy from 1947. So this is an oil painting, and you can see the similarities between this all over design and this randomness, as well as kind of an unplanned surface. So the American artists continued to work. Hayter's studio seemed to be especially interesting for young artists. They continued to come. This is a young artist, American artist by the name of James Getz. He is part of our exhibition, Brilliant as well. He hangs right alongside Hayter. So what you're seeing in Getz, he created a portfolio in 1946. This is one of the prints in that portfolio. So he's also creating a similar situation, but he's a lot more finer. He brings out more of the details and almost creates a biomorphic object that's sitting in space rather than this all over plate. It becomes more sculptural, more seen as an object floating in space or sitting solidly in space. The next piece is also from that portfolio, Primordials, engraving and etching on paper. This almost looks like an abstracted landscape. You can see how he's created a horizon line and really brought out a lot of textures and details, but a lot more cleaner in his presentation. And then the last piece I'll show here from our brilliant exhibition, I mentioned her before as working with the Atelier 17 is Louise Nevelson. This is her West Queen. The plate was probably produced in 53 to 55, very close to when Hayter's print we're showing was produced. This is an etching dry point with aqua tint and soft ground. So once again, you're seeing a different approach to Hayter, but she's, Nevelson is showing more of her sculptural appeal and interests with the aqua tint and just a few engraved lines, some darker than others, but you can actually see the face made out, and also kind of more geometric shape that brings to mind maybe her later sculptural works as well, this kind of compartmentalized shapes. So to conclude about these works, I will leave you with a quote from Hayter once again. And his interest in art, I think, is one such that we can look at him as a visual artist, but also as this conduit from surrealism through abstract expressionists in America, and then, but also as this sort of incredible artist that continued from the early 20s through his death, creating an incredible body of work. And he states the purpose of his art is to lead man to a fuller understanding of his terms of existence, to aid people to live more completely and escape from the history of human error, to demonstrate by example that the human mind has unlimited capacity to go further and further the more one demands of it. So thanks.
Thank you, Bob. We're very grateful to you and for figuring out the technology, and to everyone for joining us. So like I said, as we normally do in Lunchtime Looks, I'm going to take some questions via the chat function. We've had a couple people already, Bob, say that they needed to leave, but to thank you for the little lunch break reprieve and some art talk during that time. Some people have had to check out. But if anyone has any particular questions for Bob, I'm kind of monitoring the chat function. And while I am kind of looking, and again, you're getting a lot of thank yous and greats and wonderful. So while people are kind of processing and thinking about questions, I guess maybe I'll start with one. Is that one thing that has struck me is that this triptych was the title called Combat. And I'm really interested, you mentioned that Hayter had to relocate Atelier 17 during World War II. And I'm interested kind of what the impact of kind of those social and historical circumstances, how that plays in with the idea of, the automatic line or any of his philosophies or things like that. I mean, I think the quote you just gave touched on it a little bit, but I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Well, several things. One is that the title Combat refers to actually the Spanish Civil War. He did an earlier piece entitled Combat from the 30s, and that related directly to the Spanish Civil War. A lot of artists, for instance, Picasso and Guernica, and we have a Mauricio Lazansky in the collection that also referred to the Spanish Civil War. It's a little confusing with this print being called Combat, because I think he realized late in the process of creating this in the 50s, that in the 30s he had another print by the same title. And so some of these are actually seen in the edition as entitled Battle. So I think as a lot of mid-century artists, the world wars had a big impact on the artists and their psyche. And I think that is definitely referenced in a lot of Hayter, and particularly the Guez, James Guez pieces, because he was a soldier and actually spent time in World War II, was wounded in action, and as he was recovering, he came back to New York and made those prints in Atelier 17, and unfortunately died. And I'm not sure if it was related to the injuries or what had happened, but he only died a few years after creating those prints. And Hayter went back and printed that edition and published it after his death.
Great. And so a more technical question, Beth Hestick wants to know how the color is embossed.
Okay, well, thanks, Beth. I know you have a big interest in prints. It's a little tricky. Did I do that on purpose? No. Oh, here we go. I'm sorry. So the print itself is, how he's worked with color is directly in the sort of aqua tinted areas. So the color areas are not necessarily embossed. The embossed areas are the white areas that you're seeing here and here and here. And I wish I had a close detail. It's really hard to shoot these works under glass, but you'll just have to come and see them in person. But the embossing actually takes place here because the depth of the plate is carved into in such a way that the pressure of the plate allows the paper to basically swell into that void. So it's the embossed part, but the color itself is not necessarily embossed, and he has applied that color area to the plate itself, the aqua tinted areas.
And I actually have another technical question, plus more of a philosophical one from Chris Wilkinson, who, no matter the format, I can count on for a question. So his first technical one is, what does the term soft ground mean?
Oh, soft ground, as I was trying to explain about it, it's the material. The ground is what is applied to the surface of the plate. It's called soft ground because it is not, it's malleable. It's like a waxy surface. So when I was explaining about the fabric is literally pressed into the soft ground, that exposes the plate itself so it can be etched. I guess I wasn't as clear as I thought I was being about that material as well. But in a general etching format, you would use something called a hard ground, and that is on the surface. It's much more impermeable. You have to scrape through the ground to expose it to the acid to make a line.
Okay, great. And so now for Chris's more philosophical question. He is interested in this idea of automatic drawing, and he says that he is skeptical about the claim that the image results from automatic drawing, that the automatic drawing arises from the subconscious. How would we know, especially when we see that subsequent development of the work requires conscious and deliberate decisions?
Right, right. Well, I think you'd have to take it up with the surrealists directly about that. But the process in which they were doing it, I think involves clearing your mind and literally allowing for turning the plate, allowing for randomness to occur. Now, of course, you're going to vary the pressure of the burin. There's going to be conscious decisions made. It's not completely subconscious. And then like I said before, as soon as that sort of initial process happens, then it becomes completely conscious, because the artist then starts working with the plate, pulling the image back out. So they feel like the image started through the subconscious, but then the conscious mind starts to build on that image to create what they want in that, in what they're seeing out of the original lines.
So it's a bit of a back and forth between the kind of idea of the unconscious, which, to Chris's point, it's difficult to pinpoint what exactly is fully unconscious. But as you said, that's a larger issue of all the surrealists. But then also those conscious manipulations that come in the later bits. Another small question is, what is the size or scale of combat? So this is one of the disadvantages to not being in the galleries, is that we never can really feel, is this a giant piece or an itty bitty one? So do you know the exact dimensions?
Yeah, that was a major faux pas on my part, because that's usually what I would put in this. I would guess that I should have Karen chime in with quickly running to TMS and getting those. But I think they're about 14 by 18 plate size, something like that. Maybe, I think they're a little bit, maybe 12 by 18, something like that. But that gives you a general idea. I'm sorry, that's my mistake for not having that. That should be right there.
So they're not massive, but they're slightly smaller than, slightly larger than like a sheet of paper. And the exhibition, they're displayed as kind of a triptych, next to each other on the gallery walls. And speaking to that idea of the exhibition, we actually have someone who's not from the area, and so normally wouldn't be able to attend our Lunchtime Looks, but kind of asking a bigger picture question about the exhibition itself, since they haven't had a chance to see it. And speaking to the role of prints in the show and our collection, and what it might say about the role of printmaking as a large, diverse, and versatile medium. So you've talked a lot about the role of printmaking in our kind of acquisitions and why we focus on print so much. So if you can maybe expand on that for our audience, I think that would be great.
Sure. I think that of course, it's my background, my interest. A lot of it lies in prints. I have an affinity for it. I appreciate things like Hayter's work and how the surface is formed and printed. It's something that I feel is an art form itself, and it's not smaller in any way to other fields like printing and drawing. That an artist like Hayter is a good example of someone who is creating a work of art that could not be done in any other medium. So I do think that prints stand on their own in that regard. We collect prints because the price point can be a little bit less. They're not as expensive as large canvases, although some prints can be quite expensive, and we cannot actually afford them for our collection. But that's how we're able to get a nice collection. I think they show well together in our gallery space. And my personal philosophy is that they don't necessarily all have to be put in the Dean Print Gallery, that prints can work throughout an exhibition with any other medium in which we're putting together. So yeah, I think that
Yeah.
my interest in prints is one that I think is reflected in our collection, as well as how they're displayed within the gallery.
Great. So a couple other little things, and I'm going to put a last question and a last comment up there. So first, we had a comment that someone was able to kind of zoom in and think that the annotation on the prints was etat, E-T-A-T, which means state, as in state proof. Is that something that would make sense, Bob?
Yes, that would.
Sure. So
But,
that's probably what that is in the bottom there. And
and I think one of them might actually have the ESSAE. I would have to look again, the test as well. But yeah, the state is definitely one of the other print.
yeah. And then another question is, and I think this is a good one to kind of round out because it is forward-looking, is how would you characterize Hayter's influence on the current generation of printmakers or artists or the Atelier's work?
Well, I mentioned briefly Petterdy. Gabor Petterdy was worked many years at Atelier 17 and studied with Hayter, and later then started or was the head of the print shop at Yale. So he turned out a lot of students. Lazansky worked with Hayter, and he took a lot of his techniques to the University of Iowa. And so a lot of students came out of Iowa. My undergraduate printmaking professor studied with Lazansky at Iowa. So, you know, I in turn then learned some of the methods through my professor and my undergraduate professor. And I think the last, there was one other one that I was thinking of. He's escaping me right now, though. But there was a real sort of resurgence in prints in the 60s as these artists moved out and formed printmaking programs in the United States at major universities.
Right. And so I think that this actually ties really nicely into the last comment that I kind of want to share. And most of you can see the comment bars that are sent to everyone. And please, some people have shared some resources, some video links. So please just take a look at that. But I wanted to read this one from Ann Wine that says, "This is great. I'm here from Sunnyside, Queens. On a side note, when I was a freshman at WVU, Robert Bridges was one of my first drawing teachers. I am currently an art teacher in the NYC. Remote learning does have its advantages. I would never be able to attend a lunch lecture in real life." So I think that both to the question of kind of the genealogy of Hayter going all the way down to Bob and now Anne is a really nice way to wrap up, but also a nice way to say, even though this is not our ideal and we really miss being with those works of art in person and we really miss being with you all in person, there are some perks here, and we really are grateful to all of you all for tuning in today, for following along with us on social media. We are doing our best to provide some outreach and connection to our collection with you, and we're really grateful to those of you who are partaking in that, and please be on the lookout. We hope to have more live talks like this. I'm doing some recorded videos, and we have some other ideas as we move forward in the new normal, and hopefully it won't be normal for very long, and we'll get to see you in the gallery soon. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Bob for a wonderful and engaging presentation, and stay in touch and be well. All right, take care, everybody. Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.